In addition to using language appropriately and vividly, in order to use language effectively, we want to use language inclusively. And when we use inclusive language, we are using language that avoids placing any one group of people above or below other groups. And this includes avoiding the use of gender-specific language. So, for example, we want to avoid using language that privileges one of the sexes or genders over another. We want to avoid, for example, the use of the generic he or the use of man where we could use human. So, as an example, we could say that if a student needs to study, he could go to the library. But that's gender-specific language, right? We are assuming that the student who needs to study is male. Instead, we could say if students need to study, they could go to the library. So we're using plural pronouns or using they as a singular pronoun in order to be more inclusive, in order to say that the student could be male or female or something else. We don't really know. It doesn't really matter. We could also use non-gender specific language simply by saying, for example, humankind rather than mankind, right? Because again, that's very male specific. And we also want to be careful with our gender-specific language when it comes to job roles. For example, when you think of a doctor, you probably think of a man, whereas when you think of a nurse, you probably think of a woman. But in reality, there are a lot more male nurses these days and a lot more female doctors. And so we want to check those assumptions whenever they happen in our heads. But in addition, we want to make sure that we are not specifically gendering something when we don't need to be. For example, you could say, I went to a male nurse today and he told me that I needed to rest. The use of the word male in that sentence is completely unnecessary because you use the pronoun he later on in the sentence, so saying male nurse is an unnecessary qualifier, right? We don't need to specify that this was a male nurse because that is kind of implied by the use of the word he later on. So we want to avoid that sort of gender-specific language, especially when it's unnecessary like that. We also want to be aware of language surrounding ethnic identity. And this type of language refers to a group of individuals that identify with a common culture. So, for example, we could have Mexican Americans, Italian Americans, and when we're using this type of language inclusively, really the best thing that you can do is to ask a couple of people who are part of a specific ethnic group how they prefer to label themselves. Because ultimately, that's what is going to create the most successful language possible, right? Because if you are simply making assumptions based on what you already know about another ethnic group, your assumptions might be completely false. For example, people who are of African descent, right, might prefer the term African American, and other people might prefer the term Black, right? And there's sort of this challenge, this battle between those two terms, even within the community itself, right? So you talk to one person and they might say, I prefer the term African American, and the person standing next to them might say, I prefer to be called Black because my ancestors aren't from Africa, they're from Haiti, for example, right? So really, you have to ask the people who are a part of that ethnic group what language they prefer. Now, in some cases, it's going to be a little bit more obvious based on modern times. For example, most people who are part of the American indigenous culture prefer to be called Native Americans versus being called Indian because Indian is very much a misnomer, right? That was a label that was inappropriately attached to them. And so many people who are part of that indigenous culture will tell you that they prefer the term Native American over the term Indian. So there are going to be some instances where you will know kind of instinctively which one to use, but ultimately it's always going to be best to ask a member of that ethnic group which label they prefer. Similarly with sexual orientation, we want to make sure that we are using inclusive language surrounding sexual orientation and that we are not being heterosexist. If we are being heterosexist, we are assuming that everyone in an audience is heterosexual or that opposite sex relationships are the norm and that anything outside of an opposite sex relationship is abnormal. So, for example, if we are talking to a group of women, we don't want to assume that everyone in that room is going to have a boyfriend or a husband. Instead, we can use gender-neutral terms like spouse and partner. And when we're using this sort of inclusive language as well, we want to use the LGBTQ label, right? Gay, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, rather than saying homosexual, right? Because many people who are a part of that community will tell you that the term homosexual is far too clinical. And in fact, it was used to describe a psychiatric disorder up until the 1970s. And so they much prefer, many people who are part of that community rather, would tell you that they much prefer to be called gay or lesbian as opposed to homosexual. So again, asking a member of that group, a member of that community, what labels they prefer is always going to be your best bet. We also want to use language that is inclusive when it comes to disability. And when we're talking about this specifically, we're talking about putting the person first, right? Putting the person before the disability. So rather than saying that someone is a handicapped person or that it is a group of handicapped people, instead we say that they are a person with a disability or they are a group of people with disabilities. And it's a small shift in language, but it's really so important to members of this community, right? Because you are acknowledging that they are a person before they are their disability. And so saying that they are a person who uses a wheelchair versus a person in a wheelchair, again, a very small language shift, but it can mean the world to someone who is a member of that community. So we just have to make sure that we are using this inclusive language, right? That we are using language that doesn't make any one person feel like they are lesser than another person. Finally, we want to make sure that we are using familiar language. And basically, the idea here is that you want to use language that you are familiar and comfortable with. Because ultimately, the more comfortable you are in a speaking situation, the less nervous you're going to be. So if you are not comfortable with the language that you're using, you're going to be more nervous. So use language that's familiar to you, use language that's familiar to your audience, and both you and your audience are going to be better off.